So today, the topic for our session is sort of Vestry 101, chapter, bishops committee, etc. And let me just acknowledge the reality that it is virtually impossible to tell you everything you need to know in this session. Right. So this is going to be an overview on the highlights and things that I in particular find essential. Okay. And so part of that is going to be, if there are questions about any of this, we'll have time for raising them at the end, and there's always the opportunity to go deeper into what we are saying. So I'm going to share my screen. And then we're going to, see if I can do this. Nope, I can't. Okay. I say congregational leadership, because it's not just Vestry's 101, although I will use that term as a shorthand for chapters. And chapters are usually the term we give for cathedrals. I would say our particular cathedral functions more as a vestry than a chapter. A classic cathedral chapter usually has members from throughout the diocese, but that's okay. Vestries and bishops committees. And the classic definition is a vestry is from a parish and a bishops committee is from a mission. In many ways, you're going to function the same way in practice. Okay. And so it really is about being in congregational leadership in your congregation. And so the first thing I want to do is say thank you. Right? This is important ministry. Thank you for agreeing to serve in this way. Thank you for your service to your congregation. This matters. It makes a difference in the life of your congregation. And it really, I can't say it enough. Thank you for stepping up and being part of this. And I just want to reiterate, one of the things we say in this diocese is that there are 4 main areas of congregational leadership. And the 4 main areas are spiritual discernment, planning and leading, organizing and working, and fiduciary and legal. Now, I did a session on each one of these last winter, sort of December timeframe, and those slides are available. I think for some of them we remembered to film and some of them we didn't remember to film. We're getting better at this, but in each one of these, there's important things to know about what it actually means for these 4 areas. So for instance, planning and leading is the head and heart aspect of helping you discern what God is inviting you to, well, after you've discerned what God is inviting you to do, figuring out how you're going to do it. Organizing and working is actually organizing your congregation and getting it done. Fiduciary and legal is the financial, the legal, the canonical. And then there's spiritual discernment. And we're going to spend some more time on that because that is your first task of congregational leadership. But those are the 4 main areas that we really stress in this diocese: spiritual discernment, planning and leading, organizing and working, fiduciary legal. And if you want the larger expanded version of each of those 4, let us know and we can get them to you. But the main thing to remember is that the church is the body of Christ. The church is not the building. And in some ways, the church is also not simply the individuals in that particular congregation. We talk in our Eucharist about how we offer our prayers with angels, archangels, and all the company of heaven, right? We say that, for instance, the identity of a congregation is not just those people right there, but those who have come before and those who will come after, right? So the church is the body of Christ writ large. It gains its identity and authority from God. A way to think about this is that God's mission has a church. The church doesn't have a separate mission. God's mission has a church. So the overarching responsibility is to seek the mind of God. This is one of the most important things you do. I would say the first duty is to listen. This is about that spiritual discernment part. And when we think about the English words to listen and the English words to obey, they actually share the same root. In the Benedictine life, we talk about listening with the ear of our heart, the ear of our heart, right, is how we're called to do that, to really listen to God. We are first and foremost beloved children of God, called to seek the mind of God, to listen to God, to do the will of God. And that is what spiritual discernment is all about. So as members of the vestry, as members of the bishop's committee, as members of the chapter, as members of congregational leadership, what we're called to do is be people of prayer, to read the scriptures and to hear God's voice in the life of the congregation. And so part of the questions that you're called to ask yourself is, in what ways do you as individuals and do you as the entire group model faithful discipleship? How do you lead by example to the rest of your congregation? This is an essential question. One of the things that's really important to ask is are God's vision and mission your guiding principles for everything you do, your budget priorities, your congregational ministries? Again, God's mission has a church. These are the questions of spiritual discernment, right? And so what that means is when you're gathered, you're really called into prayer and study and to listening for the voice of God. So when I was thinking about this, I said, what we ought to be able to do is blame God. And then I said, no, blame God sounds bad. We need to credit God, right? If we can't credit God for the decisions we make, especially anything that's controversial, and perhaps not enough prayer and discernment has taken place. Now, what do I mean by that? So if we were called to, for instance, say we are going to bring in, I mean, a particular question before us right now is, do we bring in and support and sponsor Afghan refugees? There are ways of thinking about this question that are separate from Christian ways of thinking about it or congregational ways of thinking about it. As congregational leaders in the church, we are called to ask, is Jesus calling us to take this action and why? We need to be able to say, we believe God is inviting us into this ministry. And if we don't have the ability to say why we think God is inviting us into this, we haven't prayed enough. We haven't done enough discernment, because it's all about what is God inviting us to be and do here and now. And it's important to say here and now. The invitation of God for the people in a particular congregation in a particular place is not necessarily the same invitation for different people in a different place and a different time. We are in 2022, 2 years of a pandemic. That is a different time than 1952, than 1972, than 1992. All of those had important things happening in their time frame, but it's different from ours. It's different from now. And the place matters. What are you called to in Yakima? What are you called to in Oroville? What are you called to in Pomeroy? Your place matters. So it's really essential that we ask, what is God inviting us to do here and now? And be able to really say, actually, we believe, after praying, after studying scripture, after being in conversation, that this is the action God is inviting us to take. Okay? So spiritual discernment is your first duty, seeking the mind of God. Now then, there's also what we call the canons, and the canons of the church. And we use the word canons for a variety of things. I have canons on my staff, okay? And we also talk about the canons. The canons in this case, we're referring to the constitution and canons of the church. And the canons come from the word that means basically measuring rod or rule. And they're, as legal representatives, vestry members are subject to the constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church, of the diocese, and of your own bylaws or standard operating procedures, and of the laws of the state. So it's important to actually know your canons, to read the canons, and to reflect on the different roles between the vestries, the bishops' committees, the priest, the bishop, etc., that lead to partnership and mutual ministry. Okay, because the canons help lead to that. The good thing about the canons of the Episcopal Church is it means individual congregations actually don't have to reinvent the wheel. Right? There's a way of being as vestries and bishops committee that's already set for us. When you look at the canons, there are separate partnership roles for clergy and laity. So there are different roles, and yet they're in partnership. So one of the things that we're called to do is mutuality, mutual ministry together as vestry and rector or bishops committee vicar, etc. And let me say that by canons, rectors and vicars chair the vestry and bishops committee meeting, unless they decide to invite somebody else to do it. Their role is actually the chair. They can invite somebody to chair the meeting, but their canonical responsibility is as chair. They're also in charge of all staff. Rectors are in charge of all staff. Right? They're in charge of buildings and grounds, they're in charge of worship and programming, but it would be a foolish rector who did all of that without being in partnership with their vestry and bishops committee. Canons of the church have a subsidiary role. The canons and constitution of the Episcopal Church, the wider church, supersede and have a rule that you have to succeed to those canons. So the diocesan canons must be consistent with the Episcopal Church canons. They cannot violate them. They can't be against them. They can't say something different. Congregational bylaws or operating procedures have to have as their opening clause that they are subject to the diocesan constitution canons and cannot be that they operate, that canon cannot actually be amended or changed. Right? They are subject to diocesan canons. Diocesan canons are subject to Episcopal Church canons. This is all the fiduciary and legal part of the vestry's role. And so it's really important actually that you look at the canons. There's not a lot in there. There's a lot of flexibility, but looking at what you have in terms of your own bylaws or operating procedures, look at what the diocese says, look at what the Episcopal Church in general says, and then ask yourself, out of those different roles, how does that lead us into partnership with our clergy or how we're called to operate? So a simple thing, for instance, all property is held in trust for the larger body. So anything you do as a congregation that would change the value of your property, like you want to sell it, you want to add to it, you want to buy something, you want to go into debt for something, you have to get written permission to do so. Because all by the bishop and the standing committee, all property is held in trust for the larger body. And then sort of one of the things that vestries do is they approve the budget, usually. It's pretty rare for annual meetings to approve the budget. It usually is the vestry. Just like on the diocesan level, diocesan council approves the budget. But beyond the budget, there's a fiduciary side of things. So one of the questions to ask yourself, how is their vestry talking about and modeling stewardship? Not just approving a budget, but stewardship as a whole, as a way of life, right? How do you think about this role as a way of life? All right, so let's talk about a little bit. So first rule, first duty is seek the mind of God. How we're governed is there's a part of that to the canons, how that measuring rod or rule. Let's talk about how we operate in practice. This is different from what the canons might say. This is actually how people might actually operate. And there are times when any of these are useful, and there are times when any of these have problems, right? So all have strengths, all can be useful at a particular time in the life of a congregation. So one of the ways that we operate sometimes is a vestry, but this is more common in a small congregation, is as a committee of the whole, right? We have some congregations that say, yeah, our bishop committee is the congregation. That's acting as a committee of the whole. And it's common in the smallest congregations. The challenge is that we might act that way, but canonically, there's no such thing. And so if a formal bishop's committee all of a sudden decides to not practice that, it can lead to some complications. The other complication can be when people come into the Episcopal Church from other traditions that expect that this is the practice, that actually the congregation votes on everything. And they will say, well, you didn't ask me about that, right? Or you didn't seek my opinion about that, or I didn't vote on that. What you're hearing there is the expectation that you're going to act as the committee of the whole. There are times it's useful, very useful, to seek the opinion of the whole congregation. But to operate as a committee of the whole, unless you're a very small congregation, will be problematic in the long run. Okay. So another way of operating in practice is as a counsel of advice to the cleric. This is sort of a classic father knows best model, right? It has been used in the past. It's a traditional model. And I would say it does not necessarily model shared accountability and shared leadership. It's giving advice to the priest who will then make the decisions. Sometimes this is useful. Sometimes what the priest really needs is the vestry to be the counsel of advice. But if the only way the vestry operates, the only way the bishop's committee operates is a counsel of advice, you are abdicating your authority and your roles, right? You're abdicating the partnership that you're actually called to have with the priest. And so while it might be okay for certain times of in the life of the congregation or for certain things in front of you, it as a standard practice, it is not the practice that we think is life-giving in the end. And the obverse of that is the business board with a chaplain, right? This is where folks on the vestry say, it's okay, Father John, you just pray for us and we'll do the work, right? We understand money, we understand property. You just stay right there and look holy. It's a denigration of the priest, right? And what the priest brings. And the problem with this one is it assumes that a church is a business. And while there's a business aspect to the church, or at least a nonprofit style business, the church is the body of Christ. It is neither a true nonprofit nor a true business at all. It has aspects of that are important, but it also, it really assumes that it can be done the same way. Now, what's good about this is we're inviting people to bring the expertise they have and use it on their vestries. If you have financial understanding, or if you have business understanding or property understanding or understanding about education, bring that to the work, right? But the bad part about this is when they assume that just whatever I did in business, I can translate without any problem into the church world. And all the priest is called to do is offer a quick prayer at the beginning, and then we're done. Okay. Another traditional model of operating is operations management board. We see this a lot in the past. This is a vestry where you typically say, okay, we're going to appoint a member of the vestry to all the various committees. And you're the liaison to all the committees. And you're going to come back and you're going to tell us what all the committees are doing. And our job is to manage the operations of the church by being assigned to a committee and then coming back. And that's a classic way that vestries have often functioned. And that's not bad, right? It also can be problematic because not all vestry members have the same. I mean, let's just say you get assigned to a committee that you have zero interest in and zero, you don't understand it at all. Or let's say you get assigned to something that, and then there's another person assigned, another person. I mean, it can be problematic in terms of transfer of information. Am I micromanaging? What is the actual job of the vestry? It's that sense that what we're called to do is manage the operations. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but can have challenges. Spiritual board. Vestries that see themselves as spiritual boards, this is a great way of thinking about your role. Again, your first duty, seek the mind of Christ. And so you'll see this with vestries that spend a lot of time in prayer and discernment and Bible study and growing their own spiritual health, which is great. One challenge might be abdication of governance. We don't do money here. Somebody else does money. We'll just, whatever the treasurer tells us, that's fine because we don't really get it. Or we don't really understand the property side. Whatever the junior warden tells us, that's fine. We don't get it. It's that abdication of really trying to understand the whole system. So while the spiritual board is great, it can be problematic if you also abdicate the rest of the work. And then the partnership board. And this is where governance is seen as shared missional vision, entering into the work of the church, sharing missional vision, where you really see you're in partnership with the priest. The goal is to seek the mind of Christ and to empower the work of the congregation into that mission and that vision. Now, all of these have goods about them. All of these can be healthy in a particular time and for a particular place. What we would argue is that the partnership board idea is in the long run the healthiest, right? But that doesn't mean there might be times in the life of a congregation where you would engage in operation in a different way. Not all vestry habits are healthy or productive. And really the question is, what mode of operating is best for this particular congregation at this particular time? So I want to stop for 1 second and invite you to put into the chat, what model of operating do you think your vestry, bishops committee, chapter, etc., in this past year has actually been operating under? Committee of the whole, council of advice, business board, operations management, spiritual board, partnership board. How do you think you've actually been operating? Not what you want, right? Not what you say, but how you actually do it. Just go ahead and put that into the chat. All right. I'll let you keep doing that, but I'm gonna move on. I want us to think about meeting agendas and structures. When you are planning your meetings, and by the way, meetings that go over 2 hours lose their effectiveness very quickly, right? If your meetings routinely go over 2 hours, you need to really seriously think about how do you restructure that. So when you're thinking about your meeting agenda and your meeting structure, think about the 4 main areas of leadership and structure accordingly. So if your primary task is actually to seek the mind of Christ, you need to spend time in spiritual discernment. You need to spend time that's more than just an opening prayer at the beginning and move on, right? You really need to say, how is God inviting us to really think about entering into God's mission here and now? What's God inviting us to do? What's God inviting us to see? You need to spend time in spiritual discernment. Then you need to do the head and heart work of planning and leading. And I really want to emphasize it's not just about the head work. I tend to lead with my head. I really have to take time to stop and say that there's heart work as well, right? And so how will Mrs. Jones think about the idea you've just had, right? What will Mr. Smith say when you say you're going to totally dig up the front yard and do something else? I mean, all of that is really thinking about the effect on people, and how we're being invited to think about the heart as well as the head. We need to think about what invitations are needed for the organizing and working. If we're going to do something, literally, how do we invite people into that? Who's going to be in charge? What's the budget for it? How are we going to make sure it's getting done? We need to plan time to review what we've done, evaluate, and make changes. It needs to be part of the agenda and the structure. And we need to be responsible for the fiduciary and legal, the budget, the finances, the treasurer's report. And let me just say, if going into a vestry meeting, you do not understand how to read a treasurer's report, stop the treasurer and make them teach you, right? Do not abdicate. Do not sit there in silence and be confused by the treasurer's report, right? Part of the treasurer's job is to help you understand the finances of the church. And if the treasurer can't do that, have somebody who can. Sometimes people know something so well, they can't translate it for people who don't understand that language. But you really need to be able to read a treasurer's report, read a balance sheet, read the fund balance and understand it. And if you can't, have time in your vestry meeting to really learn how to do that. Don't abdicate that job to somebody else, okay? Because that's part of your job. Because once you learn how to do it, then it's pretty straightforward. And it won't take 45 minutes to do a treasurer's report because you'll get it, you'll understand it. So what we often say, so the focus of the meeting, first and foremost, should be God, and then everything else, right? You need to know by your canons, how often do you need to meet? So one of the congregations I was at, turns out by our bylaws for the congregation, we needed to meet 9 times. That was it. We started taking August off. Everyone wanted a month off, right? You need to know that vestry meetings are open to your congregation. They are not closed meetings unless you are in executive sessions. And executive sessions are governed by the Constitution and canons and by state laws, because the state views you as a nonprofit, and the state laws actually govern when you can be in executive session. That usually is when you're talking about issues of employment, okay? Not just, I'm really upset with somebody and I want to complain about them, all right? Vestry meetings are, in fact, open to the congregation. You need to have a way of structuring your meeting and developing your agenda so that most of your time is actually spent on the things that are most important. I can't tell you how many times you go to a vestry meeting and you spend lots of time on trivial things and less time on the most important things. I see this at diocesan conventions sometimes. I see it at general conventions sometimes. I don't know how many of you remember the diocesan convention where we spent 45 minutes debating a resolution that we encouraged people to plant trees. Encouraged people to plant trees. We weren't even requiring, right? 45 minutes on that. I found myself just going a little nuts. And I was leading that meeting. So, but how do you organize it? So what you're spending most of your time on is clearly the most important. It'll be really, really important at the very beginning to set group norms and expectations. How shall you be together? And to do this together, not impose them on people. But it's really important, if you have expectations for your vestries or bishops' committees, that you expect people who are running for office to follow, you should list that ahead of time. Before people are elected, they should know what are the expectations. Right? List them. We put vestry expectations into clergy letters of agreement. That should be listed prior to every election. People should know what's expected of them. And then we strongly suggest a structure that has formation as the beginning, right? You start all of your meetings with formation, a time of formation. I strongly recommend a structure that includes, that suggests that you do things by the format of formation, information, discussion, decision. And I've talked about this in the past. This structure only works if you follow it exactly, right? If you try to do an old-fashioned model of rector's report, senior warden report, junior warden report, treasurer report, committee reports, and put that into the structure, it does not work. This particular structure gives formation a significant time, and then it bases things on whether it's given to the vestry for information's sake, or do you need to talk about it, or do you need to make a decision about it? And it has nothing to do with who it comes from, and everything to do with what type of action you're taking. Do you need to know it? Do you need to discuss it? Do you need to decide about it? If you use this format, it will transform your meetings, but it can't be impose an old structure on top of this or this on top. It has to just be this way. And I'm happy to talk to any congregation at any time about this format. And I'm a convert to this years and years and years ago, because it transformed every committee every vestry I was ever on. Okay. We are on a sacred journey, right? And your work is holy work. Our goal in this diocese is that your time in congregational leadership is a time of spiritual growth and health, right? We want you to find your time to be one that has enhanced your spiritual life, not hurt it. I believe that healthy, effective vestries help make healthy, effective congregations. I really do. And so you want to engage the work which builds up your spiritual health. You want to be mission shaped and mission focused. And you need to recognize the symptoms of dysfunction and address them. They will arise. So when your vestry meetings or bishops' committee meetings, chapter meetings, when they become less joyful, ask why. Seek the why. And so, for instance, some classic symptoms of dysfunction are when people are unwilling to participate. They just don't engage the conversation. That can be also an avoidance of the elephant in the room. That can be avoidance of conflict. What's the elephant in the room is often the question. Parking lot conversations, where you go out and then have the real conversation, right? You're just all polite to each other, and then you go out and bitch at each other, or you talk about somebody else. Gossip, rumors, those are symptoms of dysfunction. When you're dreading going to the meetings, when you are not joyful, when you're not able to laugh with one another, that recognize those early on, addressing them will be helpful, because that will drag down the health of your group. I want to encourage you to think outside the box, right? The ways of being the church 15 years ago are not the ways now, and they won't be the ways 10 years from now, right? The ways of the church 50 years ago are not the ways now. Feel free to think outside the box, to experiment, to be creative, try new things, be in partnership. Most importantly, be in partnership with your clergy, and know that your diocesan staff is here to be in partnership with you. We are here to help you. Any of us is happy to help you make your vestry meetings a better experience, a more powerful experience, an experience of spiritual health. If you think, you know what, our meetings are actually not very effective, would be delighted to work with you on helping that happen, and to become more effective, more faithful, more effective. All right. So like I said, I can't do all of what you need to know as a vestry in a short period of time, and I've gone a little longer. So let me just say again, thank you. Right, thank you very much. May this time of service to your congregation be one of joy and encouragement and optimism and excitement and support of one another, and most especially spiritual growth for all. So with that, let me stop screen sharing. I gave a lot. I recognize that. But let me ask, what type of questions or comments come to mind? And the easiest way to do this is to use your raise hand feature. I've got multiple screens on my computer, so I can't see everybody. So if you can use your raise hand feature, and the raise hand feature for most people should be under the reactions tab. You can actually, there's a raise hand. If you do that, you'll pop up right to the top of my computer. But
Susan Hodgen is raising her hand, Bishop.
Yep, so I'm seeing that. And yeah, so try to use the raise hand feature if you can, but Susan, go ahead and ask.
Would you recommend certain books from the church about the vestry? For example, we just had our annual meeting. We have people that have remained on, people are moving, so that transitioning. How about maybe just a spiritual book about the role of vestry? Would you recommend one to kind of really solidify us with people, particularly from outside of the faith? This is their new church.
Sure. So there's two books that are really useful. One is God's Grace and Robert's Rules. And that's a really good little tiny short book that talks about the function of vestry, how we're called to seek God's will for us, how do we pray, how do we structure ourselves, how do we understand Robert's Rules, right? There's a vestry handbook, right, that actually Jan Griffin is holding it up. It's a vestry handbook put out by the Episcopal Church Foundation that is really, really useful. That goes alongside the financial handbook that every congregation was sent, also put out by the Episcopal Church Foundation. Those are really useful.
Bishop,
and if
can I
you're
just
not, go ahead, Jan, go ahead.
say there is a thing called the Vestry Handbook. This is not it. This is the Vestry Resource Guide from Forward Movement, put out by the Episcopal Church Fund. Please don't confuse it with another publication called the Vestry Handbook. We're encouraging everyone to get a copy of this who's on a bishop's committee or vestry. It's a 19, and you may have an old edition. Please get, this is 2015. Please get the 2015 edition. You can buy it from Forward Movement.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing is that there is and I'm sorry, it's 10 to 8, my mind just went blank. Episcopal Church Foundation has, what's it called? Vestry papers. So you can sign up for vestry papers. They will send you every month good articles about operations of vestries, what you need to be doing, how to think about things. It is a really good resource. Susan, go ahead.
One of my big things in working with our vestry, when I came on to vestry, I never had a job description. And I heard there was one, but I never saw it. And so things evolve. And so one of my things that I've been doing is writing job descriptions, and I'm writing draft on them for people in the laity. So we know how, we have people that move, retire, that kind of thing. And I hate starting from ground zero, but I feel like even in vestry, we need a retreat within our body, and we need maybe to make this part of our small group ministry within ourselves. And we usually start with like check-in prayer, checking in, those sort of things, because we are, we have a part-time vicar at this point. But I see the need to clarify what our roles are. So number one, we set ourselves up for success. And I agree with you when you mentioned in your presentation, one thing I learned years ago was ask two things: what could be changed so you don't beat yourself up, and then what was good so you don't beat yourself up, and then what could be changed so we find areas of improvement. So I don't know, I think we're on the right track, but I feel like I just wrote a job description this past week. It hasn't come to Vestry yet, but I know part of it is, safeguarding God's children. Everyone needs to do that one. But you mentioned several things in your presentation we need to be doing. So I'm going to incorporate those into that, but maybe I don't need to do it if it's already done.
Yeah, so again, the Vestry papers and the Episcopal Church Foundation has some really good job descriptions for vestries. Some of them will not always apply to your particular congregation, but they're good jumping off points.
Okay.
The other thing I would say that a line I heard that I really, really like is, who does it better and what can we learn from them?
Thank you.
Which is slightly different from, what do we need to change? But,
Yeah, who does it better?
and what can we learn from them?
Thank you.
Clay, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute for a minute. I just wanted to comment that when you did your first bishop or wardens and treasurers conference before the pandemic, you mentioned the formation, information, discussion, and decision
Mhm.
model. We have been using that at St. Matthew's now for close to 2 years, and I cannot say how much it has improved our Bishops Committee meetings and how much it has helped. So I strongly commend it to everybody. If you're not doing that, consider it, and I'd be happy to, talk to anybody who wants to talk about how we do it at St. Matthew's. But it's an amazing thing, and thank you, Bishop, for giving it to us.
And also, I didn't make it up, right? I got this out of a book by Neil Michelle out of the Diocese of Dallas. And he has 2 books that I highly recommend. One, and the one that's specifically related to vestries, bishops, committees, et cetera, is Beyond Business as Usual. Andrea, can you type that into the chat, please? Beyond Business as Usual. The first place I saw this was in a book specifically focused on clergy, which was How to Hit the Ground Running, right? It's about clergy going into a new place. But Beyond Business as Usual is the book by Neil Michelle, that really stresses how to function differently. So yeah, and let me stress, you cannot simply impose an old way of being into this model. I've been to some vestries that had, information, rector's report, treasurer's report. That is not the point, right? It's about what you are called to do with it, not who is giving it. So if you have this model, the treasurer might have different points in the meeting. They might be information, there might be something to discuss, there might be something to decide. The junior warden, the rector, the senior warden, the committee might have different places. You put it in based on what you're called to do with it, not who is giving it. So yeah, Brett.
Thanks. Can you speak to the formation portion of that 4-part meeting? I can imagine that being community formation. We're kind of forming a community, a small group, or a spiritual formation, personal spiritual formation. What are you seeing in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So it can be about how you're forming your vestry as a small group. Absolutely. A group of prayer, a group of study, a group of how you will be together in deep conversation with each other. You might decide that this year, what you really need to be thinking about is particular forms of leadership. And so you might engage in Bible study around different models of leadership. You might do what we have passed out this year on God's hospitality. You might start every vestry meeting with the Bible study and lectio around engaging the hospitality of God. You might decide that what we really need to do this year is just engage in deep prayer around who are we called to be, and design some lectio around that, or what is the mission we're called to do now. Part of that really is being in partnership together to say, what do we think we need for this coming year for us to live more fully into the leadership that this church needs? So there's no one size fits all. But I do want to stress that, I mean, I used to say a good 20 to 30 minutes of a 2-hour Vestry meeting should be formation. Because, and the reason why I say this, and I'm a believer in this, is because if you do that, usually a 2-hour Vestry meeting is more like an hour and a half. Because if you've truly engaged deep formation, the rest of it is pretty straightforward. And if you don't, you end up talking about matters that aren't necessarily that important. Other questions or comments or concerns? It was very broad overview. I get that. And I'm happy to talk to any Vestry Bishops Committee, et cetera, about more details on anything. And you know, our regional developers, our regional canons, my diocesan canons, which are different from the Constitution canons, are also, we can help you with that.
So I guess I'm there. Susan, again.
Diana.
Am I muted or unmuted?
You're unmuted. I can hear you.
Okay. Are there any books specifically? We have a lot of, I think a lot of it has to do, I'm on the Vestry, but I think a lot of the differences in the reaction beliefs within the congregation is generational. So at one of our meetings, we discussed the ability, or perhaps if there was a book or something of that nature that the congregation could read to understand, maybe that we're all trying to believe the same thing. We just do it in a different way. But there seems to